Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com talks with Carson Cristiano, who is the Executive Director of CEGA. And if you haven't heard of them before, CEGA's mission is to improve lives through innovative research that inspires positive social change. And if you're new here into this podcast, you definitely want to press subscribe, either on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to look at how can we use innovation to make life better for people. So Carson, thank you so much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emil. I'm happy to be here.
So how would you describe CEGA to someone that is not familiar with your organization?
So CEGA is the Center for Effective Global Action, and we're all about making better bets when it comes to poverty reduction. So we do this by generating evidence on the effectiveness and impacts of programs, policies, and even products designed to reduce poverty and improve people's lives. And I'll note that while we care about poverty globally, CEGA focuses primarily on the poorest countries in the world. So think about places like India, Peru, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, where institutions and markets tend to be weaker, data are often harder to come by, and where there's a lot of foreign aid money being spent in ways that frankly aren't always effective. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in these contexts, not least of all related to human behavior. So how will certain people respond to different types of programs, policies, or products offered in the market? Our goal as a research center is to help reduce that uncertainty as much as possible by providing information, not just about the impacts of the interventions, but about why those impacts occur. So what are the underlying mechanisms? And this information helps decision makers, so that could be a government agency, an NGO, a donor, or even a social enterprise, make better bets and not gamble with people's lives.
I really enjoyed that way of putting it, gambling with people's lives, because if you're someone that is donating and it's a lot of money, that's a huge responsibility. If you're making mistakes, that is going to cost people's lives. And at the same time, not everyone has the time to do all of this research into a complex world. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this research and share it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So could you give an example of some work you're doing where you're helping someone make a better bet?
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give you a quick example. If you're thinking about how to improve sexual and reproductive health outcomes for young women in Tanzania, you might think that educating the young women themselves about their choices would effectively empower them. But of course, there are strong cultural norms at play. There are underlying biases and beliefs that lead both the young women and their male partners to make certain decisions. And of course, you have to think about the availability and the cost of things like contraceptives in the location that you're studying. So Manisha Shah, who's a CEGA affiliate at UCLA, and others worked with the NGO BRAC in Tanzania recently to test out a youth empowerment program that actually included the boyfriends of the young women in a goal-setting activity that was designed to educate them about sexual and reproductive health and encourage them to make better decisions. And it worked. They found that combining programming for the boyfriends they actually had a soccer activity along with a goal-setting activity with educating the young women and providing them with free contraceptives, which they didn't have access to previously, was highly effective at reducing partnerships and driving better questions like that across a range of topics. How can you drive better learning outcomes for kids? How can subsistence farmers and small businesses adapt to climate change? And questions about how governments themselves can be strengthened to catalyze rather than get in the way of social and economic progress, which is what we all want to see.
Wow, I can see how much it helps for bright minds to come in and give clarity on these highly complex topics. And I understand that often it's not at all the obvious solution that is the best bet you can make.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
who is behind CEGA then?
So CEGA was founded by Ted, Miguel, and a handful of other Berkeley faculty in 2008. That's the University of California, Berkeley in the United States. Ted is famous for his work with Michael Kramer, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics
Mm,
in 2019, in part for their joint work on the long-term impacts of deworming in Kenya. Today, we're a network of almost 150 affiliated faculty. They're based at institutions all up and down the west coast of North America. We also have hundreds of PhD students in our network and a growing number of scholars from East Africa, South Asia, and other regions where we work. We're highly interdisciplinary. Our researchers use a variety of tools and rigorous methods, including but not limited to randomized controlled trials or RCTs. And they measure the impacts of anti-poverty and development programs. CEGA also cares deeply about the credibility of our research and social science research more broadly. So we've invested a lot in driving higher standards for transparency and reproducibility. And by the way, we have about 20 full-time staff right now running programs and writing grant proposals at UC Berkeley because we
mm.
need money to fund this work.
Whew, yeah, I can imagine. So, what is kind of making you different as an organization then?
Hmm. So I think two things that I'm really proud of and that I think make CEGA stand out are that we're inclusive and we're innovative. And these are two things that we believe are critical to driving policy impact, which is our ultimate goal. So on inclusivity, from the very beginning, we work closely with partners in low and middle income countries to make sure that we're studying the right things. That our research agendas address real world problems, so problems that decision makers actually are facing in real time, and that the evidence is taken seriously and adopted by decision makers. So for example, in the Dominican Republic, Paul Gertler and a few others worked with the Ministry for Social Protection to basically redesign the National Cash Transfer Program that was reaching, I think, about 2 million people at the time in a way that better met the needs of those beneficiaries. I think giving them more flexibility in terms of access to their funds and the timing of spending those funds. So coming up with the research questions in direct collaboration with these government partners all but guarantees that they listen to you when you have results to share. And then from day one, CEGA's worked hard to empower scholars from the countries and regions where we work to both contribute to and to lead rigorous impact evaluation research. And we do this through fellowships, training programs, and inclusion of local scholars in CEGA-funded research. We do it because we think it's the right thing to do, but also because we think it's a better bet. So actually, we're really excited that the now almost 40 East African scholars that we've trained at UC Berkeley through our fellowship program have since gone on to launch their own research network called NIERA. That's the Network of Impact Evaluation Researchers in Africa, and they're engaged in some really cool policy relevant work. So that's the inclusion piece. On innovation, I mean, there's no one size fits all to driving no one size fits all approach to driving evidence-based policy. So I mentioned that we use a range of cutting edge methods, and more we're implementing projects that use new types of data and data science approaches like machine learning to better understand specific development needs on the ground, but also to track patterns of development over time. So it turns out that the big data coming from satellites, from mobile phones, from sensors, and so on, are really useful in helping us predict what's happening on the ground. So how wealthy or poor someone is, how good or bad the roads are, how much forest cover remains, what types of crops are growing, or what types of crops grow well, and how much water is left in a reservoir. And we can track this stuff with really high frequency over time. Of course, you can't get rid of in-person surveys entirely. You need that ground truth data to train your algorithms. And there are a number of risks that must be mitigated. Remember that computers are trained by people who are biased, but it's an exciting frontier and one that CEGA is really hoping to push. And one really quick example of using new types of data that I wanted to mention is Catherine Wolfram, who's an economist at Berkeley in the business school, and Prabal Dutta, who is a computer scientist, and others developed a mobile phone application where they can crowdsource information on power outages. They've been testing this in Kenya and Ghana. So not only does the technology allow researchers and the Ministry of Energy and the government to more quickly address failures that are happening in the grid, but it helps us understand what the cost of those outages are to households. So Catherine and Prabal and their team are studying like the social and economic impacts of those outages on households. So put another way, what is the value of reliable electricity, or what's the return on investment in better grid infrastructure? So I think it's really cool what CEGA and our peers are able to do when we think outside the box, so to speak, in terms of the type of data that we're using.
Wow, I can imagine the complexity that goes into the way you collect the information. So it makes me curious what the challenges are for you then. Is it to get, with all this data available, is it to get the right kind of data? Is it to analyze it in the right way? Or is it to use the people you have included kind of on the ground to influence decision makers and governments in these countries?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, there are a lot of challenges here to driving evidence-based policy. And on the data front, I mean, there's a lot of data in the world, too much probably, I would argue, but getting the right data to answer important questions, especially in the context of poverty, is a really big challenge. So think about places where there's conflict and civil war, or where governments aren't functioning well enough to conduct a decent census or any census at all. So we believe that we can help decision makers generate more useful insights. We're doing a project right now with the government of Togo called Targeting Aid Better, which is a good example of how these data can be used to help increase the capacity of governments to use novel data sources. So we're helping them use phone records combined with satellite data to identify exactly who needs a cash transfer the most in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're also using call detail records to generate credit scores for people who don't have bank accounts. So I think there's this big problem in terms of what is the right data, and then how can we use it in a really meaningful way while avoiding the biases that I mentioned earlier. Another issue, as you alluded to, is getting policymakers to use evidence for decision making. It's really hard. There's so many things that can get in the way of policy impact and basically dooming your research to collecting dust on a shelf. At CEGA, we found that collaborating directly with governments and other decision makers from the very beginning is a pretty good bet. And actually, right now, we have a postdoctoral researcher at CEGA named Alexandra Jakubowski. She's been working with a few Ugandan researchers at Makerere University and with the government of Uganda to figure out how to get people to socially distance and wear masks, and then to track what happens as a result. It's really opportunistic, and we wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't already have the strong partnership with colleagues. And then the third challenge that I'll mention to driving evidence-based policy, it's a problem that the majority of social science research in a country like Bangladesh or in Zambia is still conducted by white researchers in North America. And that's not entirely, there are many researchers of color, even in our network, but not enough input, not enough research is being led by by researchers who are from the countries that we're studying. And this is not for lack of talented, motivated researchers from these countries. Thankfully, the development research community, like many other communities right now, is having a bit of a reckoning. And we're looking at the various ways in which our systems for producing evidence, for publishing evidence, and translating that evidence into policy might be biased, and thinking about how we can break down those institutional norms that perpetuate the biases. I guess a good example is that a lot of top economics journals typically get some, and sometimes a lot, of submissions from scholars, from authors in low and middle income countries, but they're not accepted, and often they're not even reviewed because they may not be written well, they may not be organized well, or they don't have a well-known author listed to get the attention of the reviewers. But their ideas are good. And so CEGA is working really hard to bridge this gap through our fellowships and training, and by offering mentorship. So it's been great to see the donor community shifting a little bit to place more bets, so to speak, on local leadership. And so we think it's paying off.
Got it. So with your inclusivity approach, you understand that by including locals and working on projects that maybe these governments already want, and they're included from the beginning, so they feel like, this idea is actually coming from us, from our people, and we were in it from the beginning, then they're much more likely to implement it.
Exactly. And I mean, the partners in Togo that I mentioned are, it's our faculty co-director, Josh Blumenstock, who is sort of leading on the machine learning approaches, but the government partners that we have there are very interested in learning these methods and in continuing to use them, well beyond the collaboration with CEGA. So I think it's really exciting to see how much hunger there is for these tools and approaches, but there's still a really big gap because Western researchers still dominate for so many reasons, dominate the literature, and we built the systems, and now we're sort of dominating the systems.
Got it. So we've just been talking for a short time, and we're just dipping the toes into all the different topics where CEGA is doing research and look for ways to improve the world. Now, I guess there are, for everyone we talked about, I guess there are 10 to 100 more. So I'm getting curious, out of all of the positive things that will happen in the future, which ones are you the most optimistic will really improve the lives for people?
Yeah, it's a good question because we work across a lot of different sectors, so it's sort of hard to pick. I am really excited about the innovation in data that I talked about, data being used both as a way of measuring poverty and development, but also in terms of a response to poverty, like the targeting aid stuff that I mentioned. We're also seeing non-traditional data used to target agricultural interventions, to deliver services in a range of other contexts. One thing that's kind of exciting is that data is now being used to tailor programs and interventions to better meet the specific needs of individuals. So there's a nonprofit called Precision Agriculture for Development that was founded, I think, 5 years ago, based on research by a number of development economists. And they're providing customized insights to farmers in an effort to increase their productivity, their profitability, and their sustainability. But it's really giving them agency. It's shifting I'm excited about this trend that we see right now. We're shifting the decision-making from the donor or the NGO or whoever is implementing the program to the actual beneficiary, giving them the tools that they need to decide, giving them the information, often it's just information, to make good choices that will lead to better outcomes for them and their families. So I'm excited to see how we can apply this sort of precision development approach in other contexts.
Yeah, that's really exciting and highly scalable as well, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
So we're coming towards the end of the interview now. What can someone do to keep up with the CEGA and also, all the things you're doing research on and all the new innovations that might come in the future?
Yeah, it's a lot, but I hope that we've started to make our resources more accessible to a broad audience. So, I mean, first, go to our website, cega.org, and you can browse all the programs that we run and our research. But if you go to the bottom, I think our monthly newsletter is a really good digest of cool new research coming out. And it'll share working papers, blog posts. We have a Medium blog where we translate our the technical research for a non-technical audience. My mother reads the impact note word for word. This is our monthly newsletter, and always comments on what she finds to be most interesting. So that's my barometer. As long as she's digesting it and able to tell me what she thinks is most exciting, then we're doing something right. So let's see. I mentioned that we can't do this work without support. So a lot of our funding comes from the Gates Foundation, the USAID, the Hewlett Foundation, and others. But that funding is all restricted. And so we benefit a lot from having a small but committed group of private donors who provide untied funding that we can use to continue to explore new areas of work. So if you are interested in supporting the research that we do, you can donate through our website. There's a little button that says support me. And then just in general, I think, be skeptical. My advice to everyone listening is to, if the impacts of a nonprofit or a social enterprise that you're curious about are unknown, like dig deeper and, encourage your friends to educate yourselves and to find out if there is evidence on the interventions that you're interested in supporting. I mean, that evidence base is growing, and like I said, I hope it's becoming a lot easier for non-academics to search and to understand, but we still have a long way to go. So thanks for listening. Hopefully you learned something useful.
Yes. One more question.
Yes.
Speaking of placing bets, let's say I gave you $100 and I want you to place that bet for me to end poverty. Where would you put that money?
Only $100?
Yeah, $100 for now.
Oh, wow. Can we call it $1 million?
Let's call it $1 million.
Oh, interesting. I mean, gosh, I think based on all the research that has come out in the last couple of years on the cost effectiveness of giving people cash, not in all settings, but in a lot of settings, I would probably, give most of that money just to give directly,
Wow.
to get that cash directly into the hands of people who, need the money. But, I run an organization that it can turn that $1 million or even that $100 into using it to really understand what's working and what's not. So I would pick an intervention or a program that is very promising and that we think could be scaled widely and run some tests to see if it's worth betting on.
Beautiful. I like Give Directly. It's such a easy to understand approach for the heart as well. This money will go directly to this family, and it's easy to imagine the benefits that it's making. We actually had an interview with them, our 5th interview maybe. Yeah. Anywho, Carson,
Cool.
thank you so much for taking the time. You broke up a bit.
Co-founders of Give Directly is sorry. One of the co-founders of Give Directly is the CEGA affiliate.
Okay.
So
yeah, really cool organization.
Yeah.
Well, Carson, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. I highly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Emil.
Thank you. And for you listening, if you enjoyed this episode, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because then more people can learn how we can find innovative solutions to end poverty. Thank you so much for listening, and we see you in the next episode. What is great.com? That is the most common question that we get. And the shortest answer I can give you is that we are a company that is moving money from the online casino industry and donates it to charities that is helping the environment. The long answer, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you today. But if you're curious, definitely Google what is great.com to learn more.